I think that you should know someone well enough so that you know if you can negotiate with them, and so that you have started to formulate a vision of your joint future that you can both look forward to with enthusiasm and confidence. So, and of course that's going to depend to some degree on your level of maturity, but that means you've considered such things as, do you have a sufficient number of joint interests, and are you oriented in the same direction with regards to how you're going to handle your joint careers and the possibility of children, and the manner in which you're going to interact with your in-laws. And you have to start thinking about, you have to start considering your life together from the perspective of practicality and economics, I would say. So it can't just be that massive erotic attraction that's associated with love, although I think that's extraordinarily important, and you're unbelievably fortunate if you have that, and you should do everything you can to maintain it, and that takes effort, that takes real effort and will. But you need to ally that with maturity and intelligence, and the maturity and intelligence is, okay, we're going to put our lives together. What's that going to look like at the level of detail? How are we going to handle our finances? Where are we going to live? What are our joint plans going to be, etc. One of the things that my business partners and I plan to do in what would you say, that in as an analog to the self-authoring suite, is that we want to develop an online program to help people negotiate their relationships. And so it would actually provide an answer to this question in a more comprehensive manner, is that imagine that if you want to set up a household with someone, then there's a lot of things that you need to get straight, and you either do that by bringing your unconscious assumptions to bear on the situation and perhaps clashing where they don't match, or you sit down like a conscious and aware and articulate couple and start to negotiate what your joint responsibilities are going to be. And so that would be, well, who's responsible for the meals and when, and what are you going to eat, and who's going to get groceries, and who's going to pay the bills, and who's going to do which part of what household chores there are to do, and how is that going to be laid out fair. And so you should get to know the person that you're with well enough so that you can start discussing the real practical issues of life and determine whether or not you're capable of negotiating that. And I don't think that necessarily means that you should live together, because the evidence is actually quite strong, at least the last time I looked, that people who live together are more rather than less likely to be divorced. Now that might have nothing to do with the actual act of living together. It might be that people who are more likely to get divorced are also those who are more likely to merely live together. But I don't think that's a great solution for reasons I won't get into now. And with regards to being shackled together, is that that's a complicated one. And I learned this at least in part from reading Carl Jung. And the idea there is that unless you've really made a commitment to someone, like a lifetime commitment, and that's a serious commitment, one that you're not going to back out of, you're not going to take the relationship with the seriousness that's necessary to make it of the highest possible quality and sustainability across the course of your life. And it's really important that it is of that high quality and sustainability, because the relationship, especially when it starts to produce children, is a machine, let's say, a machine that you jointly operate, that adds immensely to the quality of your life and the depth of your life. I mean, you have the rope and strand of your life, and your partner has the strands and the rope of his or her life, and then those are tied together to make a stronger rope, and then that unites you across time, and then you undertake massive adventures together. And some of that is the establishment of a household, and the establishment of joint careers, and the maintenance of each other's mental and physical health, and the maintenance of a high quality sexual life, and all of that. Very, very challenging to do all of that. And then the joint production and care of children, which sets you up properly for the last half of your life. So like, I'm 55 now, and both my kids just got engaged in the last month. So that's pretty bloody amazing. And they're both setting up households, and they're stepping into adulthood. And I'm fortunate enough to have them in the city that I live in. So hooray for me. That's so bloody fortunate that I can hardly believe it. I mean, we've helped them out and tried to make it what would you say, to make the possibility of their living here be something that's viable. But I'm absolutely thrilled that they're going to be around, and I'm looking forward immensely to having grandchildren. And like, what else are you going to do when you're 55? You know, and you're going to be 55, I might have 40 more years. Like, what am I going to do with those years? Well, so I have a good marriage, thank God for that, and that's partly due to the outstanding moral quality of my wife, who I'm also extraordinarily attracted to. And you know, we've built a life together, and we've had kids together, and we're happy with our kids. And we had plenty of struggle with our kids, because one of our children, my daughter, had serious health problems, which she seems to have managed to resolve, partly as a consequence of her own brilliance. But you know, we've set ourselves up now so that our children are respectable and mature young adults, so thank God for that. And they've got partners who we both really like, and they're going to have children, and well, hooray, you know, that means that this next part of my life is going to be something that I can advance into with a fair bit of hope and excitement. And the idea of having little kids around again is thrilling, because I really like little kids. They're really fun. And so the shackled together is more like it's such a, I may have even said that, but it's such a cynical way of looking at it. It's more like what you've produced is an unbreakable bond between two beings, and that makes both of them better in every way if it's a relationship that's based on trust and genuine communication. That's a very difficult thing to attain, because you have to be willing to tell the truth, and the truth is generally a horrible thing. You know, I mean, it's easy to tell truth when everyone wants to hear what you have to say, but it's very difficult to tell the truth when no one wants to hear it, least of all yourself. And so marriage gets a very bad rap in our culture, and so does child rearing. And I think that's absolute catastrophe, because really, being in a long-term relationship, a marriage, let's say, and having children, that's 2/3 of your life. Even if you're a highly career-oriented person, that's 2/3 of your life. And I'm a highly career-oriented person, and my family has been unbelievably important to me, and has also been something that's enabled me to be very effective in my career, because my house has been a sanctuary for me, and thank God for that, especially many times in my life, but especially over the last year. So you should get to know someone long enough to know that you two can tell the truth with each other, communicate, and negotiate, because the most important part of a relationship is the fact that you can tell each other the truth and negotiate. Stromboli is not happy with the tangled mess, but then the crowd reacts very positively, and then that confuses the conscience, because he thinks, well, look, this is horrible, this guy's a tyrant, like Pinocchio's making a fool of himself, everything turns into a tangled mess, but the crowd goes crazy. And well, being a fool, that can be entertaining, right? So it's hard to tell when a crowd, especially at a spectacle, because this crowd is at a spectacle, you just don't know exactly why it is that they're responding positively, but you've definitely given them what you want. And you can see this look on Stromboli's face. It's like this false kindness and generosity, public facing. And oh well, anyways, the conscience is very confused. And I really think this is an important thing, because I've often thought, I spent a lot of time thinking about Hitler, and I was thinking, well, how do you get into a state like that, you know? And you think, well, he's a dictator and he led his people down a bad path. It's like, that's not right. That is not what happened. They had a conspiracy together and went down a bad path. Now, think about it this way. If one person thinks something about you, it's like, whatever, right? But if 5 people tell you that, well, what? Then to start not taking that seriously is kind of narcissistic, right? And if it isn't 5, let's say it's 15 people tell you the same thing or act the same way towards you. It's like, probably you should clue in. Well, what if you're a politician and you're trying out a bunch of different ideas, and you're good at interacting with the crowd, you're charismatic, you watch the crowd, but you're not necessarily all that articulate, you don't have your values all straightened out, but you're kind of angry too. And maybe that's because you spent a bunch of time in World War I in the trenches, which was like no joke, and all your friends got blown up. And then you were unemployed, and then you tried to be an artist, and that didn't work out, even though you were moderately talented. And then maybe the economy fell apart completely on you, hyperinflation. And then maybe there was a communist menace coming in from the
east, and there genuinely was. And so you're not the world's happiest clam at that point. And you're talking to people who aren't that happy either, because they were also badly defeated in World War I, and then they had a terrible treaty they had to sign, and they lost part of their territory. And so the crowd's not happy, and neither are you, and there's reason for it. And so you start talking to them. You don't know what you're upset about, and neither does the crowd. So you start to articulate some things about why you might be upset. And some of them fall flat, but you're paying attention to the crowd. So you stop saying those things. And some of the things make the crowd really wake up and listen. And so you start saying more of those things, right? It's an unconscious dialectic between you and the crowd. It's mediated by consciousness, but it's not like you're sitting there saying, although you might be, I'm going to tell this crowd more what it wants to hear. It's more sophisticated than that. And so you do that 1,000 times, and you do that to ever increasing crowds. And the crowd really starts to go mad. And they basically tell you that you're the savior of the nation. It's like, how many bloody people have to tell you that before you start to believe it? You know, I would say with a typical person, 100 will do it. That'll get you going, man. If 100 people tell you specifically why you're special, you're going to be thinking, even if you're kind of humble to begin with, you're going to be thinking, geez, there's got to be something to this, man. But if it's 1,000,000 people and they're roaring their approval, well, and then when it's a whole nation, it's like, good luck withstanding that. There's just not a chance. How are you going to withstand that? Now, you could be like Gandhi, and you could have taken that into account beforehand, because he did. He read Tolstoy, by the way. He was a student of Tolstoy, and it's very interesting, because Tolstoy was the person who developed the techniques of nonviolence that Gandhi used. And Tolstoy was also a deeply religious writer, apart from his novels, which are not, I wouldn't say, really in the religious category, although they're profound. Tolstoy stressed humility with nonviolence. He really stressed it, and that's what Gandhi took to heart. So he lived a very, 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 very simple, bare-bones, ascetic life. And that was to kind of see if he could keep his damn ego tamped down while the groundswell was building behind him. You know, and he dressed really simply, and he didn't own much, and he ate very simply, and he just tried to stay away from the whole materialistic success element that would be an element of what would turn him into an actor and also inflate his ego. And, you know, he seemed to do that pretty well. You know, he certainly, well, he led a nonviolent revolution that resulted in the independence of India. It also produced a terrible civil war and the separation of the Muslim Indians from the Hindu Indians. But I don't think you can precisely lay that at the feet of Gandhi, right? But what I'm saying is that you have to be an extraordinary person, you have to be extraordinarily wise, and you have to take ridiculous precautions if you're going to put yourself in the public sphere like that and expose yourself to that kind of adulation without becoming a puppet of the crowd. And that's what happened to Hitler. I mean, it's not like he wasn't also a conscious manipulator and surrounded himself by people who were propagandists and all of that. So there was a conscious element, but you got to think these things through and see how that dialectic develops. Like, he learned how to appeal to the darkest fantasies of the crowd. He was really, really good at it. And that was a dialectic process, right? The crowd told him what they wanted to hear, and the crowd's a mob at that point. So I don't have to take responsibility for the fact that I'm screaming my approval when I'm surrounded by 1,000,000 people. So I can scream my approval for whatever I want, for whatever dark, revengeful fantasy might be playing out in my imagination, because I'm not going to be held accountable for it. You know, if you listen to a complex piece of music, or at least this is my experience with complex music, is sometimes the first time I hear it, I don't really like it, and I think I also don't understand it. I actually can't hear it. You know, maybe a musical genius could hear the whole thing instantly, you know. Say, Franz Liszt, they say he could sight read anything on the piano first try. So, you know, some people are so intelligent musically that it's incomprehensible, and I'm sure they hear things just fine the first time they hear them. But then what happens for me is that if I listen to it a couple more times, there are pieces, chunks of it that start to fall into place that I can follow, and you know, I can see the beauty sort of shine through those, and then eventually the whole thing links together, and then I can listen to it, especially if it's a complex piece of music, many, many, many times. And the more complex, and probably the better the piece of music, the more I can listen to it. But if I listen to it enough, at some point, then I've had enough of it. And it's all a very strange phenomena. Because one of the things you might ask yourself is, what exactly are you learning while you're doing that? It seems like you want the music, it's something like you want the music to be just exactly the right amount of predictable and unpredictable. And if it's too unpredictable, then you can't understand it. And if it's too predictable, it's boring. And so it's just like a conversation that way. It's actually just like life as well. Because you want things to be predictable and stable. And you want things to be unpredictable and interesting. And the degree to which you want each of those is going to depend on the time and the context, and also on your own intelligence and temperament. So now I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories and give you a number of pieces of information, and hopefully they'll click together. Now, I think the reason that this information has always been transmitted in story and image form is because it's very, very difficult to transform it into fully articulated explanation. It isn't really how it works. We're not really accustomed to thinking about the idea that there are certain forms of information that are valid forms of information that can't be transmitted verbally. But of course, if you think about it, we all understand this deeply because, well, I can give you a bunch of examples. The first example is that when you speak, not only do you speak in words and phrases and sentences and paragraphs, but you also speak melodically. And in fact, part of the reason that you can understand melodies and that they make sense to you is that what artists have done is separated the melodic element of speech from the semantic element and then played with the melodic element. And the melodic element tends to carry a lot of emotion and intent. And so if you're listening to someone speak, you can tell when they're being ironic, because they raise an eyebrow and their voice changes slightly, even though they might be they are using exactly the same words. And in fact, someone who's very good at being witty or ironic will set the situation up so that you can barely tell that they're joking. And the better they are at that, the tinier the hint they give you that you can still catch on to, the funnier the situation is. So we know that information can be transmitted through nonverbal channels. It even happens during speech. And then, of course, we understand that music presents to us an intimation of meaning that's very difficult to fully grasp. And music, for me, has always been an ineffable phenomena in some sense, because it carries the intimation of meaning in a manner that can't be rationally dismissed, or that people aren't interested in rationally dismissing. So even punk rock nihilists listen to punk rock nihilistic music, and they find that meaningful, even though they don't believe in meaning. And in some sense, they're victims of their own rationality, because they do believe in meaning, or they wouldn't be listening to the music, but they can't understand how they could possibly believe in it, so their rational mind has dispensed with the idea. And sometimes people dispense with the idea of meaning for lots of reasons, partly because it's inevitable in some sense with sufficient rationality, but also because it's always useful to look for the underbelly of things, because it also justifies not bearing any responsibility for your life, and that's a fairly that can be a very desirable side effect of a particular ideological or rational belief. And then there's dance, of course, and dance is even more ineffable than music, although it's often paired with music, and it grips people. If you see a remarkable dance performance, well, part of it is that you're sort of thrilled and excited about seeing just exactly what the human form can do, because partly because you're human, and when you see someone extending a certain ability far beyond the norm, then it expands your sense of what a human being is capable of. So there's that. There's just the pure skill element, and then there's the novelty element, because often if you watch a particularly good dancer, there's things they do that you haven't seen before that you didn't know anyone could do, and that's pretty fun. And then often the dance is joined with the music, and the body is expressing what the music means. And even though you can't tell what the music means, you can tell that the dance is expressing it. And see, I think what happens there is that music
represents the patterns of being. It's actually, because people think of music as a non-representational art, but I think that's wrong. I think it might be the most representational art, is that being is made up of layers of patterns constantly interacting, and hopefully in a relatively harmonious way. And music demonstrates that, mimics it in some sense, abstractly, and then the dance is an abstract representation, like people adapt to the patterns of being, and the dancer adapts to the pattern of music. And so it's a symbolic, it's an embodied display of the place of the person in the cosmos. And you can also make that case when you see people dancing in pairs, because you can dance alone or you can dance in pairs, and that's basically standard human adaptation. So, and music is interesting too, because one of the things that you'll notice is that there's always music in a movie. Almost always. There's the odd movie that doesn't have it, but it's quite marked when it's absent, you know. The movie feels a lot more cold and clinical, although it can work. But we accept the idea that music can be used to fill in the missing context in a movie without even ever questioning it, right? Like, it's very strange if you think about it, that you go to a movie that is doing at least part of its function is to portray reality in a realistic way, but there's a soundtrack playing in the background all the time, and it's so useful and so appropriate that you don't notice how strange it is that that's okay.